Yesterday, a few hours after the general audience, a man wrote that reasoning, if submitted to any serious faculty, would be returned to the student as insufficient. He's not an anonymous person on a forum. His doctoral thesis was published with a preface by Joseph Ratzinger. The name will be coming soon. First, it's a good idea to understand what he read, because the comment doesn't concern a single paragraph or even an entire sentence. It's about a single word, 6 letters, at the end of a period that concludes 8 weeks of papal catechesis on the liturgy. The event occurred yesterday morning in St. Peter's Basilica. Leo XIV gave the final catechesis of the series on the Conciliar Constitution dedicated to the liturgy. The title on the Holy See website is The Reasons for the Liturgical Reform. The Pope explains why the Council Fathers wanted to reform the rites. The document starts from a letter, the 3rd letter from the Council, that Cardinal Montini, then Archbishop of Milan, sent to his faithful on October 28th of 1962. Montini wrote that the liturgy is a sincere expression of both the divine and the human, that it is language, on the one hand, a vehicle of divine teaching, on the other, a voice in dialogue with God. And he added the phrase that the Pope quotes, "The faithful cannot and must no longer remain silent and passive, because their physical presence is not compatible with spiritual absence." The text compares those words to Article 48 of the Constitution, which asks that the faithful not attend the mystery as strangers or silent spectators. Hence, the Pope's conclusion. The participation of the faithful cannot be passive. And it's the phrase that was echoed everywhere in yesterday's headlines. The text then lists the reasons for the revision, to make the biblical texts and prayers more accessible and to streamline the order of the celebration compared to the books in use at the time. And it brings precedence, the Divini Cultus of Pius V, the reorganization of Holy Week desired by Pius VI, the rubrics simplified by John XXIII in 1960. Then came the period that ignited everything. The liturgical reform promoted by the Second Vatican Council is therefore firmly rooted in the living tradition of the Church. In the same passage, the Pope adds that understanding it correctly allows us to reject the abuses that occurred after the Council, and which still occasionally occur today. The word that opened the case was therefore. The rest of this video is the trial that opened yesterday afternoon. It was signed by Dom Alcuin Reid, founding prior of a Benedictine monastery in the Diocese of Fréjus-Toulon, who earned a doctorate from King's College London on the liturgical reform of the 20th century. That thesis became a book, The Organic Development of the Liturgy, with a preface by Cardinal Ratzinger. Reid's text was published yesterday on journalist Diane Montagne's Substack. Reid makes 2 points. First, the popes rightly have editors who prepare their speeches, and these texts almost certainly originate within the dicastery for divine worship. Second, a general audience, Reid writes, is not in itself binding and infallible teaching. We are not talking about a definitive act of magisterium. First point, and it's the one that gives the whole thing its title. According to Reid, that therefore implies a deduction, and the deduction doesn't follow from the evidence presented in the text. The verdict is literal. Whoever wrote those lines had the Holy Father pronounce the greatest liturgical non sequitur of the last 60 years or so. The reason lies in Article 23 of the Constitution, which requires that innovations not be introduced without a true utility, and that new forms arise organically from existing ones. If that article was respected, Reid observes, the problem does not exist. There is no reason to speak of a reform of the Reformation, nor to continue to celebrate the non-reformed rites. Second point, regarding the lexicon. The Council called for an instauratio, that is, a renewal, not a streamlining. For Reid, That term is later and betrays what the supporters of the new rites want to believe. Third, regarding history. Reid disputes that the magisterium intervened to adapt forms to the times. It extended locally developed developments to the universal church, or added them to Roman usage as an example. He adds a fact that can be verified in any manual. A central liturgical department did not exist until the second half of the 16th century, and it never had the mandate to periodically redo the liturgy. The fourth point, and it's the one that ends up in the title, is that a radical reform of the rites, Reid writes, wasn't actually necessary to make the liturgy more accessible after the council. The evidence he brings is one that cannot be discussed at a table. The full, conscious, effective, and extraordinarily fruitful participation that is seen today in non-reformed rites. Fifth point, regarding Montini's quote. For Reid, it's unfortunate because the liturgy shapes the Christian but isn't primarily didactic or catechetical. It's a cultic activity. It's adoration. It must be said that Reid recognizes the text's merit on this point. Further on, he quotes Paul Cicine on the liturgy as the primary source of that divine exchange in which the life of God is communicated to us. His comment is just one line and is worth more than a page of polemic. Paolo VI's editors were clearly better. Sixth point, on Article 48. Reid doesn't say the exegesis of the papal text is false. He says it's anemic, and that the Holy Father deserves better for his speech. The point is one word. The liturgy is not an opportunity for a true relationship with God, as if it were one among many. The Council calls it the pinnacle of the Church's activity and the source from which her strength flows. This is why, he argues, incense, Latin, Gregorian chant, and prayer facing east have a privileged place in the Western Rite, and the Council did not call for their abolition, but for the formation of the faithful. The seventh and final point, the most technical, concerns the distinction between immutable divine elements and human elements, which the papal text takes from Pius XII's Mediator Dei of 1947. Reid admits that the distinction is partly true, but he warns that it can become pernicious because it allows everything that isn't immutable to be reduced to the level of something that can be changed at will. And he calls Ratzinger to witness, who spoke of a mistaken path, reducing substance to matter and form, and concluding that bread, wine, and the words of the institution are sufficient, while the rest is freely available. What's the response from those on the other side? First of all, a fact that none of yesterday's headlines reported. Throughout the catechesis, the Pope never mentions the ancient rite, nor the fraternity. The first argument is that the Pope did not invent anything. He quotes Article 21 verbatim, and the distinction between immutable and human is from Pius XII, not from a modern-day theologian. The second is that in the same text, the Pope explicitly rejects the post-conciliar abuses, which are precisely what critics of the Reform have been complaining about for decades. The third is conceded by Reid himself. The catecheses of the past few months, he writes, have been for the most part a reasonable liturgical catechesis, which at times made good observations. Reid doesn't conclude with a verdict, and yesterday's reports left out just that. He concludes by saying that the Pope neither intends nor wants to attack anyone. He writes that the Pope's constant calls for unity and inclusion rise above this kind of politics and asks for continued prayers for him. And he gives the final word to Benedict XVI. Let us generously open our hearts and make room for all that faith itself allows. His policies, he adds, brought liturgical peace. 50 years from now, when someone writes the history of this dispute, nothing will remain of yesterday except the exchange of words on a Wednesday at the end of August. A question that has permeated the entire 20th century, and that no general audience can resolve with a conjunction will remain. How much can a rite change before it becomes another rite? Liturgical controversies aren't measured in days. Pius XII's reorganization of Holy Week is still being debated today, 70 years later, and no one considered it settled the day it was released. What do you think? If you liked the video, comment Amen. God bless you.